how many of you understand and work in an environment where OEE is or process reliability is a regular metric? Okay, I've got a slide or two that gives us some definitions, and I think that'll help, but I may gloss over them. What I hope is that as we talk here, this becomes a conversation. If you're comfortable standing up and shouting out loud, I guess maybe the videotape won't work as well, so we will wait or hold off for the questions. But if you do have a question, by all means, raise your hand, and if we can make this as much a conversation as possible, that will be great. So, as I said, we'll start out talking about what is OEE, just to make sure we're all level set and understand the topic at hand. And then connect that OEE to shareholder value. Why is OEE important? Why do manufacturing companies measure it? Look at yield loss and how it connects with OEE. Very often, if you look at the income statement, your biggest number one expense, at least in food manufacturing, somewhere between 50 and 70% of your cost of goods sold is in materials, packaging, and ingredients. Well, yield loss is a big loss if that's the biggest chunk of your overall spend. Then how do we monetize OEE loss? So it's a number. It's oh, my productivity is at 75%. What does that mean? I mean, how can I turn that into dollars? And if I improve it, well, what's it going to bring to the bottom line? And then look at a way to systematize and use this information to drive significant and sustained savings programs rather than loss or savings ideation, kind of a low-hanging fruit approach. And then finally, a little bit about the ConAgra performance system. I didn't bring a lot of information about ConAgra, but I'll be glad to answer questions about them. But within the context of this, I can tell you what we're doing and how we're performing in our plants with regard to loss quantification and OEE analysis. So, on to definitions of OEE. Pretty straightforward. It's really an all-in type of metric, and the number one issue is, at the front end, how have you scheduled your line? Is there somebody working on that line for any reason? So the idea is, we call it heartbeat on a line. If I've got someone maintaining the line, if I've got someone cleaning the line, if I've got someone who's here and is supposed to be working on the line, but they haven't started yet because they can't find the hoses and they haven't hooked up the dispenser, that's time on the line. And the question is, when we have time on the line, are we getting productivity out of it? So we look at it in four major buckets. First off is the planned downtime, and that would be, I'm not planning to produce, but I've got people working on the line to maintain it, to clean it, to change over, or it may be crew meetings and breaks. The second area is unplanned downtime. These are, I mean to make product, but I'm not making it because I had some type of process failure, I had a stop, I had a breakdown, I had some type of problem with lack of supply, I was choked downstream. Any of these items could occur, and at the time, I've got a full crew on the line working to produce product. This also would include rate losses. So if I'm supposed to run at 1,000 per hour, that's my target rate to run on the line as opposed to the maximum speed, but I'm only running at 7,500 because maybe, 750, because either I ramped up slowly or I'm running at below speed because I've got some kind of problem with one of the unit operations. Rate loss is a critical element there as well. And then finally, we get to the quality loss. Now, a lot of folks measure their output by how many cases did I get off the end of the line. But when you get into automated systems, and we use SolarSoft and Formance in our production lines in 36 plants in the United States, there we're measuring off of PLCs that are keeping track of the process flow of the goods. And we can get very, very accurate counts. And so tactically, we can use that information very, very well to analyze our losses and really track versus my start count where I'm putting, say, the frozen food tray onto the conveyor line to how many cases actually got into the end of the line. I can measure that quality loss for weight kickouts or defects that happen during the process, but I may also lose some product outside of the production line, between the caser and the palletizer in the warehouse store. We try and take those into account as well in a strategic measure. So these 4 loss buckets really encapsulate the different types of losses that you want to look at overall in your operations. And as you can see, if I'm measuring every single time that I plan to produce or put somebody on the line, it's an all-in type of measurement. So the bottom line when I say all-in is OEE is what were my good units produced in comparison with the potential for that production line. And the potential is that scheduled time, the time that I have bodies on that line, heartbeats on the line, times my target rate for that particular SKU. Now I say that particular SKU because in frozen food, which is a very large portion of the ConAgra portfolio, you could have very simple meals where it may take 20 or 30 people on a production line to run very effectively. However, there's a lot of hand placement involved sometimes. So think of a kid's cuisine meal that's maybe a cheeseburger meal. There's a placement of a lower bun, a patty, a piece of cheese, and a top bun. We could probably invest in robotics to get that, but we change our SKUs and renovate them so quickly and so often that it's very difficult to invest in highly automated solutions for placement type of issues when we know it's going to change in the next 4 or 5 months. So the good units produced is exactly what you'd expect. Good output that meets our quality specs, our customer requirements, our food safety standards. The scheduled time is heartbeat on the line again. And then finally, lock target rate is that specific rate. And this is generally our best demonstrated rate that we've run on the line, but it starts out with an engineering expectation. You know, this line is built to run, and let's say in comparison, or in, as an example, a Ferrari. You know, it's built, it can run at 180 miles an hour, but I certainly don't want to run like that on the street. I'm going to run into trouble. I'm going to target my rate on I-95 to be 65 miles an hour, and that way I won't get any tickets. Well, we use a lock rate as the set expectation that the operators are set that dial on the line. So hopefully we all are up to speed on what OEE is. If we don't, please raise a hand. Now, how does it connect with our business needs? Now, first off, shareholder price appreciation. If you're a publicly held company, that's really the reason why you're here. That's how you can expect to continue to have employment. That's how you can expect to have a good retirement fund. If you're a privately held company, it's about owner's equity. It's about return on the investment. It's about keeping the family in the position that they are so that they're not bought out and taken over by someone who can do the job better. Now, and even more so since the last recession, where credit got incredibly tight given the banking situation, the key driver for share price appreciation is free cash flow. You can look at any number of financial studies, and they really drive down to that free cash flow aspect. So what are the things that we need out of a business to drive free cash flow? It's fairly simple. Sales revenue growth. It's not just maintaining our sales, it's growth of sales. Cost improvement. So those sales have to be grown at a margin that grows. And then finally, capital efficiency. And capital efficiency is the dollars I have tied up in my fixed assets and in my current assets, my working capital, my payables, my receivables. So a successful company will grow their sales at very good cost efficiency and be very efficient with their capital. That's going to drive cash flow. That's going to drive share price appreciation. How does OEE fit in with this? We look at performance dimensions, and you'll see just a snapshot of what many people will have in their balanced scorecard, safety, quality, delivery, productivity, and so on. But I've lined these up against our sales revenue growth, cost improvement, and capital efficiency area. And first off, in sales revenue growth, quality is number one. We're not going to get our customers to continue to buy our product if they're unsafe or if they don't meet the quality standards and expectations and flavor profiles that our customers want. Service is an obvious. We can't keep our customers engaged with us to deliver our products to our consumers if we don't deliver on time every time. And then finally, innovation. It's a continually changing market, and you can't be successful selling the same product over and over again. Tastes change, interests change, styles change, and we have to flow with those. On the cost improvement area, some folks will take exception because I didn't put safety as the number one thing here. And believe me, I'm the first one to say that safety is at the foundation. If you don't have it, you really don't have a key to success whatsoever. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you hurt your employees, they're not going to want to work for you, and you can rest assured that you won't be able to gain sales revenue growth, cost improvement, and so on. But I park it here in the cost area because financially, as we look at share price appreciation, safety is ultimately a cost issue. If I can't get the employees to work for me happily, then I have to pay them more to work for me in a coercive environment. And that's how bad it can be, and I've seen that in experience. Material usage. Obviously, as I mentioned, 50 to 70% of your expense could be materials. Huge area of control for cost. And labor productivity is another area. In ConAgra Foods, somewhere in the 15 to 25% area in terms of labor. Capital efficiency. Overheads fall into this area, although they're also part of the cost efficiency area. And then our fixed asset investment and working capital base. So these are our performance dimensions. How does OEE fit in there? First off, quality. Upsets drive process variation and quality risks. So we can't, with an unstable process, expect to get a stable output. In the service area and innovation, what we're really looking for is reliability. If we know that we need to, meet with our customer and their requirements, how can we do that if we can't have an adherence to our schedule requirements? On safety, again, upsets, driving at-risk behavior. You've seen operators running around lines trying to get it running again. Upsets drive scrap and waste. Upsets drive overtime. Non-value-added helper positions. I don't know how many lines I've seen that are designed to run with 20 or 15 people that actually have 17 or 18 or 25 or 30 on them because we have to have this person here in case that thing breaks. There's a lot of kind of overweight, non-value-add positions in many operations. If you have a chance to look around and really evaluate where the value-add positions are and where they're not. We call that exercise line balancing. Overheads, energy is a critical area. In our canning plants, energy is actually a larger expense than our labor force. Fixed assets, obviously, if we have unreliable assets where we are losing productivity and we have a growth opportunity, we may be forced into buying an additional line to produce the product we need because we can't get that out of the assets that we have. That in turn adds to depreciation costs, that in turn adds to excess MRO expenses and inventory. So it gets into a big kind of a real spiral of excess weight in your overall system, lack of nimbleness. And then finally with working capital, in order to really go at some of the lean strategies, the flexibility that you need to deliver a varying and ever-changing product offering to your customers, you have to have a stable performance base. So I think we've shown that if I want to get my share price appreciation, there's a critical set of levers here in OEE, in the effectiveness of my equipment, where if I can work on these, I can expect that those benefits will flow forward to cash flow and to share price appreciation. Now, a little bit deeper on the material loss area, and I'll go through this fairly quickly. I just want to call out that very often material loss and yield loss is analyzed in terms of how did I do versus a standard. Just as we saw with OEE, where we're measuring against a zero loss opportunity, anytime somebody is on that line, I'm going to measure that for an expectation of value production. At the same time, we should look at our material that way. So first off, when you're dealing with agricultural products, there's some conversion involved that simply, I have to take the shell off the nut. I have to take the bone out of the chicken. These are products that I can't sell to the customer given the design of the product itself. So we call those design losses, and within the SAP environment, we term that that amount that you have to have in order to deliver the quality to the product to the customer as our gold quantity. If we had no difference, if we were just taking, let's say, juice and putting it into a bottle with some additional water and other flavors, there would be no loss in that juice. It's already been processed and it's in a way that we can bring it in and take it. But if we're doing things like roasting or meat drying or so on, I don't want to count that weight loss of evaporation of the moisture out of the material as an actual loss. So a little bit of a fine point, but some confusion about that, and we had to really align on how we are going to count this when we're comparing different business units. Next is standard types of losses, and they fall in two areas, standard overfill and standard waste. Now, standard overfill would be, if we think of a bell curve of the variation that I have in filling my products, we're generally targeting some level of overfill simply to ensure ourselves that we're meeting the minimum fill weight requirement or meeting the regulatory standards for the percentage of products that conform to the requirements. And then finally, in the standard waste, that's the expectation that there are things that fall out the line, there are some contaminants, there are some light weights because of the process variation that get kicked out and so on. And this can be even into messy products like I've got evaporation or powder dispersal, or I've got some spills and squeeze out and pressurized areas and so on. But there's no expectation ever that you're going to run at 100% efficiency with no material loss in terms of actual productivity and setting our cost standards. But there is an expectation that we ought to measure that, understand it, and see how much we can attack it. And then finally, an element of yield loss is that which happens that's out of standard. All of those between that standard material loss and out of standard, we're calling our zero-based material loss, our yield loss, and not really looking at the overall, weight reduction due to moisture, evaporation, and so on. So now that we're squared on how I look at and ConAgra looks at material yield loss, how does this relate to OEE? And there are a couple of different, and I'm going to point out first the OEE drivers, but I look at 6 elements of yield loss. And the first is process reliability. This is when I have an upset, there's waste generated during that. I've got to clear the carton, or I've got to throw some material away that got crunched or jammed or spilled or sat idle while I was working through the thing, and then it's not in good shape to be able to continue processing. Process capability, and this is that bell curve of fill tolerance, and whether I target an overfill in order to meet my regulatory requirements. Material processing, and this is the messiness that some lines can demonstrate with spills, leaks, overflows, and so on. And intentional purge, and this is a critical area, especially as we're going to more and more different types of SKUs and faster changeovers to reduce working capital, is the amount of loss in terms of purging material for sanitation at the end of a shift or changeover. And then finally, other areas that not to be neglected in yield loss would be your incoming quality. Do I have to throw it away because I didn't inspect it, or it didn't meet its certificate of compliance? And material handling itself, just the logistics of moving product from one place to another, setting it down, picking it up, bumping, and so on, and whether I'm efficient in turning over my inventory and shipping it to customers, or whether it sits too long and becomes too close to its expiration date. So in every one of these areas that are highlighted in blue, those are areas that OEE and performance on the line can directly impact your yield. So very often, I mean, I think some thought processes are, especially in this concept of savings ideation, is, oh, we got a yield loss. We got to get a real problem. Why don't we put a design of experiment team on the line to figure out what we can do about reducing our overfill? Well, it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid without dealing with the root cause of the problem. And what we want to do is look at the drivers that will improve your reliability, improve your labor, improve your yield at the same time, kind of a triple play, as Joyce mentioned about many of the energy savings opportunities that we see. So, we've seen how yield loss relates to OEE and how OEE relates to shareholder value. Now I'm going to take you to the monetizing of the OEE, and that is, how do I put a dollar value to it so that I can understand where to work, how to tackle these problems? And the first thing is, all points of OEE are not equal. One of the first things that I was required to do as I came aboard at ConAgra Foods was to calculate the value of a point of OEE. And it was fairly easy math at a high level, but it was a fairly useless number. We really needed to dig a level lower and identify how costs occur when certain types of OEE issues happen. So each OEE loss bucket, if it's a sanitation, I may have a completely different crewing for sanitation at a different wage rate. I'm using different types of supplies. I'm purging material. I'm taking care of these kind of things. But I don't have my compressors on. I don't have a lot of the engines running. A lot of the systems are off. So there's a unique cost profile to sanitation itself. Contrast that with a breakdown where I may have a full labor crew waiting around or maybe doing some clean, inspect, and lube while my maintenance crew is buying emergency parts, spending time on the line, and I'm also losing material that has to be scrapped because it sat too long while we were working through the breakdown. So as you can see and imagine, oh, and energy. While I have a breakdown, my compressors are still running, my motors are still spinning, the clutches may be off, but I'm burning electricity. So in all these areas, each of these loss buckets has their unique cost profile. So I'm trying to get you to hopefully get a mental picture of how those can differ, and we've actually done quite a bit of work in mapping our SAP information, our SAP maintenance system information, our information coming out of the Informance lead system, which is measuring our OEE, our Kronos labor system, mapping them all together to analyze what is the value of a point of OEE in those particular loss buckets. This is also an opportunity to engage your finance community in these activities. In your larger corporations, in the advent of Sarbanes-Oxley, there's been a great deal of segregation of finance organization from operations, marketing, supply chain. It has to be that way in order to conform to the independence required to make sure that we don't have the Enrons that occurred in the past occur again. But on the other hand, they don't have to just wear that one hat. And engaging your finance professionals, who are very often, you know, the data manipulators, the folks that can really put databases together very quickly and cross-reference them and pull them together to really work in this area to support and engage in operations. So, now, if I look at OEE, what does it tell us to look at? And here, very simple, and these are real numbers from one of our operations. Our points of OEE, we've got a plant that's running at 70% OEE, and this is a plant total. They've got about 12 points of loss. They're doing about 90 minutes of changeover a day, and then they've got some additional sanitation. They've got 9 points of loss in rate loss itself, and then they're 3 and 4 points in breakdowns and minor stops. So if I was just using my OEE numbers, I say, where do I want to work? Well, I might say, boy, obviously, changeover in sanitation. Then look at my rate loss. Big opportunity there. Big losses. However, with 90 minutes of sanitation, I'm close to 10 points already of OEE loss. And I'm not going to be able to change the USDA requirements overnight in that area. Sanitation and changeover, I'm sorry. In addition, in the rate loss area, speed's dangerous. And we use the term that you need to earn the technical right to increase your speed. The idea there is, if all you do is you think that it's easy enough turning up the dial, there's a reason why we're running it slower, and that's not because the operators are lazy. It's because you just make more bad stuff quicker when you turn the dial up if you don't have the base stability. So you have to have the stability before you get the speed, and that's what we talk about, earning the technical right. So let's take it a little bit farther. And I'm sorry, this is a bit of an eye chart, but if we look at it, I've taken my raw and pack yield, my labor costs, my indirect labor, maintenance costs, utilities, and overheads, and through this mapping of pulling these systems together, our labor systems, our SAP finance systems, maintenance systems, and so on, we've aligned our costs in these buckets in the plant. And in this situation, I've got $1.2 million or so of loss in that changeovers and sanitation. So big numbers there. In terms of points of OEE, it's $100,000 a point. In my planned maintenance area, $120,000, not particularly critical, and I'm going to say from the first point to the last, this is probably one of the buckets that you want to see go up in cost rather than down. But some of the big hitters are that losses during runtime. We were able to identify through actual measurement using statistical process control the amount of overfill that happens and where our yield loss actually fell. And then finally, the other two big hitters are breakdowns, minor stops, and process failures. So $1.2 million in sanitation costs. Big money. We look at the overfill, $1.8 million. That's a lot of money, but how do we tackle it? How do we get at it? We're setting our targets high because of that wide variation in our fill compliance. We've got a low mean time between failure in a couple of the lines that are the big drivers in this plant. Result is we've got that process variation that's very difficult to hold tight to fill standards, and those two are very, very closely combined, those two sub-bullet points. So we looked at it and said, if we can tackle both the breakdowns and the minor stops, we'll get at the root cause. We can also expect to get that fill weight, certainly a big part of it, under control. So between those two activities of preventive maintenance and autonomous maintenance implementation, we could potentially achieve $3.4 million of savings. So probably a lot better than targeting rate improvement. And clearly, we still recognize that changeovers and sanitation are a critical area that need to be addressed. So where this is going is this savings ideation process. I've got a business plan that requires me to reduce my cost by 5% in the coming year. How am I going to get that? Let's get the management team together and think about what we're going to do, come up with some ideas, and I think we may be able to do it. And show of hands, who's been there before in that type of environment? Savings ideation. 30% or so. It's kind of a tough wheel to be on, because what you get after a while is the feeling that the low-hanging fruit is gone, and some of the savings that we made last year are popping up again this year. We didn't address the root cause. We were working on Band-Aids. So the other thing that can happen in that savings ideation is there's a lot of pet projects that happen. Somebody gets upset about the performance on a particular line. That becomes the focus. So how do you battle that and this whole low-hanging fruit issue? If you get to a loss-based improvement strategy using these tools for OEE valuation and monetization, I think you've got a much better ticket for a reliable and something that you can bank on in terms of an improvement plan. Very often, the executives in ConAgra food supply chain talk about, give me a reason to believe. And that is, don't just tell me that you're going to improve OEE and it's going to save money. Show me how that's going to do it. Show me how you're going to improve OEE. What are the AM plans that you want to achieve? How many crews are you going to be working on AM, and which step will they be on in each of the quarters coming forward? so that we're very clear that we can show we know what the resource requirements are for these improvement activities. We know what we need to do, and we've got a plan to get that done. Now, plans aren't set in stone and things change as business changes, but this reason to believe is the critical element that is really the difference between a haphazard savings ideation process to something that's loss-based and planful in nature. So, as I said, developing a strategic improvement plan to eliminate the root causes as opposed to working on that hamster wheel of Band-Aid solutions. And in particular, in this plant, their first element of their strategic plan for improvement was lean supply chain, to implement rapid changeover, to improve their sanitation and their changeover processes so that, one, we could produce the changeover purge, and in addition, improve our first hour efficiency coming up from changeover. And that was, it turns out, one of the key losses in their reliability in terms of minor stops and process failures. Second, preventative maintenance to eliminate breakdowns. And thirdly, autonomous maintenance to drive extended stop-free runs. And to really, some of that autonomous maintenance was the operators and the maintenance teams weren't working very closely together. And as you can imagine, in the worst cases in my past, I'd seen operators would run the machine at top speed until it breaks and then blame it on the maintenance crew. The maintenance crew would come in, fix it, and blame the operators for being dummies for not knowing how to run the machine without breaking it. That whole AM and PM cooperation and working together to improve the machinery, critical elements overall, but the target in this particular plant case was to reduce their overfill and at the same time eliminate the labor losses and energy losses that occurred during these AM and PM, during those breakdowns and minor stops and process failures. So that is kind of where ConAgra's focus has come to over the last couple of years of implementing TPM. I'm going to talk, focused improvement, last bullet point on here. There are some elements that AM and PM just aren't going to be able to tackle. And it was expected, and we did see this as we're working in this plant, that when we get through the stabilization of the machine line, we knew that there were going to be some trouble or some issues that we needed to tackle that needed design of experiment and other types of work where we could analyze some of the key drivers of reliability and overfill and tackle those, and it was going to be tools that are beyond the skill set of the AM and PM work. So that, in essence, was kind of a snapshot of a real strategic improvement process implemented at a plant. I'm going to skip through this slide because I'm running rather long, but continuous improvement prioritization, I'll run very quickly through, is there's a couple of key winners. And the first off, probably your most valuable, is where you've got constrained operations and you've got opportunity for growth or you're co-packing outside. The work that can be done there has a significant benefit in terms of elimination of that co-pack premium or improvement of your top line, which improves your margin, which improves your overall cash flow. Cost efficiency is a critical aspect in many stable businesses that aren't necessarily growing beyond the GDP. And then finally, working capital cash generation is a critical value adder to an overall organization. It's one of those key elements driving cash flow. And there's very often a misperception about what the cost of working capital is. And it's not just the cost of money. That may be your weighted average cost of capital right now in a general company could be in the 9–10%, depending on how much debt or equity that you have in your balance sheet. But if you look at it, there's a great deal of cost associated with handling, with the movement of the product, the weight of your overall distribution system, the amount that you have to carry there. So the carrying costs, the disposals, the aged inventory problems and so on expand as you expand your working capital inventory. And those costs, rather than being in the 9 to 10% range, we're estimating at ConAgra at 18 to 20. So significant opportunities for improvement in your balance sheet and cash flow through working capital. Finally, complexity. On the other hand, all these are great things that we want to accomplish, but how easy or how difficult are they going to be, what's the scope, what's the resources, and the requirements. And this gets back to that discipline and rigor that I talked about, as opposed to project-based ideation, but actually working on a strategic plan. If you expect, what's the reason to believe that I can get this done, that I'm going to achieve these savings in this manner, you have to understand what the resource needs are, what the time requirements are, what education needs to be done, and so on, in order to plan for success and organize for success and invest in success. So I'm going to skip over these slides. I've got about 10 minutes left. I'd be glad to start taking questions, but this is about TPM and how ConAgra Foods has established a TPM environment whose goal is to drive sustainable competitive advantage. And it's about foundation, strengths, leadership, loss analytics, high-performance work system. And high-performance work system is the alignment of everybody's goals to that shareholder value increase. And that means the operator on the floor knows that if he improves his minor stops by X% in this quarter, if he improves his mean time between failure by X% this quarter, he is directly impacting OEE, which is directly impacting costs, which is directly impacting cash flow, which is directly impacting shareholder value. And then finally, we've got an array of pillars. And pillars are centers of expertise. Owners of areas. They're broad-based teams within the plants that are working in autonomous maintenance, preventative maintenance, focused improvement, and so on, driving continuous improvement in daily operations and sustainable competitive advantage. So overall, our quality house, 80% TPM, 20% lean. Lean is a growing area. As we get more mature, we're able to tackle more and more lean opportunities. But as I said before, you really can't build advanced processes on unstable processes. You really have to have that base level of competency before you can move forward into more technical areas. I'm going to skip through this, but these are some of the type of Kaizen activities and TPM activities that address some of these yield loss areas, but they really work in many cases within the context of OEE improvement. So the takeaways, OEE is directly connected to shareholder value. OEE is a primary improvement lever for cost, for yield, for sustainability. It's very fruitful to monetize OEE for improvement prioritization and to plan for loss and elimination. And finally, in order to do this, it really requires a company to develop a system that suits their resources and their commitment to continuous improvement.